How exhausted the current electricity infrastructure in the US? How much capacity it has to support the demand for data centers?
A bit of context is that the US electricity use in total was pretty much flat for 20 years, from 2000 for a couple of decades, as things were getting more efficient in terms of, light bulbs, refrigerators, all these things really mitigated the increase. And as certain industries left the US and things like that, overall, our grid hasn't had to grow in a very long time. Not only are there kind of capacity issues, it's a whole new paradigm of these utilities kind of being ready and able to do this type of build out. So that's kind of some of the context of where we are. And then it definitely depends on the grid region you're talking about and the type of data center and the size of the data center you're talking about. Because in some cases, if someone's going to try to build a gigawatt data center or 500 megawatts, that might be more than the entire load that given utility was already serving. That might be doubling their load. And so everything is having to be built new versus, a smaller data center in a bigger area. There might be some room on the system.
What's interesting is if you look across the US, the entire US, and the amount of electricity that's generated, data centers are not a huge amount. I mean, we're talking like less than 10%, which it's still a lot for one industry, but it puts it a little bit in context that in the past, when we've looked at data centers, they've been like 1 or 2%. Now they're like getting closer to 5%. There's concerns it could get up to 10% of where we are in the total amount of electricity generated. That just shows how big the grid is. And so a lot of the challenges we're seeing is like what Sarah said, is that if you go to one particular location, there might not be enough electricity available. But when we think about, if the grid grows by 10%, then that's going to cover like the entire amount of electricity that data centers are currently, expected to use. I'm Arman Shehabi. I'm a staff scientist at Lawrence Berkeley Lab. My background is in energy analysis. I have a doctorate in environmental engineering and life cycle assessment. Now my area, like I work on a group that looks at the industrial sector of the economy and tries to understand the energy impacts across the industrial sector. Industrial sector and buildings where that crosses over, data centers falls kind of squarely in that. And we have been looking at data centers for over 20 years.
Hi, everyone. Sarah Smith. I'm a research scientist. I've been at Berkeley Lab for about 11 years. I've mostly worked on electricity, the subtype of energy, electricity use specifically, and doing electricity load modeling and load flexibility analysis mostly for California, and seeing how, EVs, air conditioners, all different types of end uses can kind of interact with the grid. And so also been working on the data center energy use topic for the last 10 years. And now, as we are seeing some of the challenges we're going to talk about with the energy system, it's become, again, very interesting to see that intersection of where load flexibility is becoming discussed more and more, and trying to see where those types of behaviors could maybe help alleviate some of the issues and kind of speed things up for the data centers.
When the company is choosing where to build data centers, they're also they're choosing the regions by if there's enough capacity to support those data centers. Is that the logic?
There's a few different things that go into when the companies are thinking about it. Definitely, is there power available? What's the cost of that power? What's the cost of the land? Is there going to be labor, availability for building the data center and operating the data center? We've seen, and a lot of people have seen articles about Northern Virginia and a lot of data centers in Northern Virginia. And the reason why is that lots of data centers have been built there in the past. So it's a lot easier to kind of go through the process to have a data center built there, because there's already that sort of supply chain knowledge of how to build them. And the policy process is kind of like it's go walk down that path before. And it's trickier when you're going to like a whole new region where data centers haven't been built yet, and everybody's kind of learning for the first time how to do it.
And I would say, up until 5 or 6 years ago, power probably wasn't really a factor. They could put that request in and get that power on a kind of typical timeline. But now it's definitely become a big driver. And one of the challenges we see on the grid management side is that these data centers, you don't know ahead of time where power is going to be available. There's no kind of top-down analysis of every spot where load could be added. So you have to submit a request to that utility and say, we want to build here. The utility has to do an entire study and then tell you, here's what we can give you on what timeline. So we see these requests going in, they're shopping around, they're just trying to understand where they can build, but there ends up being a lot of duplicate requests and a lot of requests that don't end up being realized. And so the grid planners have a challenge. They have somewhat self-inflicted, but a challenge of understanding what's real and what's going on, because now power has become such a central part of the siting decision.
If I want to build data center like in a new region, how long actually that would take, the whole process?
It's a new sort of paradigm that they're dealing with right now, because they haven't had to build in sort of these different regions in the past. And it's really been, like Sarah said, the last few years that they've been moving to, what they consider like secondary or tertiary markets that they're moving into. We're seeing data centers kind of being proposed and built like within the time frame of maybe 3 to 5 years, which is phenomenally fast to build something that like from the idea of like building it to actually getting all the permitting done and building it. That's very fast. That's not every single one that's being proposed, but there are some that are getting up that quickly. So it's possible.
We're hearing, anecdotally from folk industry at these large companies that if it weren't for some of the challenges with the power sector and things like that they could build in under a year. They could build in 6 months. You see Meta throwing up like tents to put data centers in, or to put their servers in, just to get things plugged in more quickly. The timeline Arman said is kind of what I had in mind of what we're seeing. They would love for that to be faster right now.
You reflected this on your report, right? The consumption increases, and if I remember numbers correctly, by 2028 you predicted, I think it was up, it might take like up to 10%.
7 to 12%, I think.
Yeah, 7 to 12%. And report was released, almost a year ago. Has your understanding of situation changed? Have your projections changed? Like what is actually the current estimate?
We are actually in the process right now of kind of doing an addendum and an update to the estimates that we put out last December. It's still preliminary, but like within that band that we had that we put out last December, we're still in that range, is what it's looking like preliminarily right now.
Likely at the top end of the range, but
right. A little bit more to the top end, but still within the range. Yeah. And that was looking out to 2028. We typically look in 5 years ahead, because that's when we can get sort of our best understanding of like, what is expected of the amount of equipment that's going to be manufactured and sold and be able to put into data centers. So that's one of the key things that drives in this market right now. What's driving how fast data centers can grow is like how fast essentially the chips can be built.
It comes down to, so is it TSMC, NVIDIA, like how fast they can produce the chips, and it basically do those companies sort of drive the speed of how fast data centers can be set up?
Yeah, they're a big factor to it, or like a very big factor. Like it can't go faster than they can build out.
And I would say specifically in this moment we're in right now, that it's kind of, the arms race analogy of, all these different houses trying to kind of stake their claim in the AI market. And so anyone will buy up anything that's being made and try to get it running and be able to train more, do more faster. Not sure, kind of in the past or, looking further out to the future, I think the drivers, shift a bit, but right now it's really everyone's trying to get their hands on.
That's a really good point, is that we're seeing that sort of that growth, that arms race right now, that the big companies want to build out and be the first one to kind of come up with the whatever's going to be the best AI sort of app. That isn't going to extend like that forever, because they're not really thinking about like, what's the most profitable. They're just thinking about what's the fastest. And so right now it's in that full speed ahead mode. How far you can extrapolate that out is limited.
The broader economy has a big impact here as well. Like the amount of money these companies are investing is, like Arman said, it's not sustainable to keep doing that for so long. And if things changed just more broadly, these external factors, then that would really pivot. If they lower the amount they're investing year after year, then they're going to buy less and they're going to, use less energy. So it gets very crystal ball after even a few years out. Even that's why our in our report, we have this big wedge and we have this big range, because even that, so many things could change day to day.
People are talking about that we're currently in this AI bubble, and I feel like people expect this bubble to burst. And let's say the trend continues, and let's say really companies will make like significant progress building like new amazing capabilities in AI models, and we will understand, okay, it's not just a bubble, but it's like really kind of technology that keeps progressing. Let's say it not slows down and continues. I'm trying to understand, is there like enough capacity on electricity infrastructure side to keep supporting that demand? And if we see really amazing capabilities of AI models, more and more players will come. After ChatGPT happens, how many new AI research labs emerged worldwide, but even in the US? I'm just trying to understand, is there like enough capacity to support that demand if it continues?
If you look back, we put out a report. Actually, the last report we put out before 2024 was all the way back in 2016. And at that time, we had seen there was really rapid growth in data center energy use through the 2000s, and then this sort of bending and flattening throughout like the 2010s and kind of after 2008 financial crisis and everything. And during the 2010s, social media was proliferating, streaming was starting, the internet, everything was growing rapidly in terms of the economics and the services being provided. But there were so many changes in the way data centers were built, software efficiency, hard IT hardware, everything that it mitigated that energy use. So I think it's hopefully not going to be correlated, the energy and the services, hopefully won't be correlated for very long, and we'll see more innovative, which we already see, my cursory understanding of, the way a lot of these LLM services are working, of strategically selecting which models are being used for which queries, or having the agents and the skills that are only loaded in if the query requires it, and kind of being really efficient in what's being asked of the chips. And then you can do more and more and more without that energy use really ballooning. That's what I would hope to see, that regardless of if there's no bubble, or it keeps growing and it really proliferates, that the energy use could be decoupled from that.
At some point, we would expect that. I mean, in thinking, just looking historically at the sort of the tech industry and sort of how data center growth has happened, like Sarah said, like in the aughts, like in the late 90s to, the late aughts, data centers were growing really fast. And it was a time that tech companies were really, really young, and they were building out data centers really fast. And looking back at it, they were doing it like really inefficiently. And there was a lot of ways they could make it more efficient. And they started doing that in the teens, like Sarah said, because the industry started maturing. The way to make data centers started maturing. At some point, that's going to happen with AI. It would be expected, because there's going to be like a strong sort of financial incentive to be able to provide these same services for less cost.
It's not easy to set up electrical grid, like to set up like infrastructure, right? I'm just trying to understand if there's like insane demand and insane like pressure, financial pressure, how long it will take for electricity infrastructure to catch up if there is a need for that.
Then looking on the supply side, I mean, we're talking about the data center electricity use being in that 10% range, like what we were saying before. So there has been times, if we go back to the 70s and 80s, that the grid in the US grew at a rate that it was growing at like 10% over a decade. I think in the, roughly that, in the 70s, and there were periods in the 70s to the, late 80s where it was growing very fast. So it could do that. And when we think about this idea of electrification that has been around, take AI out of it for a minute. Like we as a society have been talking about electrification. We've been talking about electric vehicles, electrifying heat, bringing more industry back to the United States. When we put all those things together, that's a huge amount of electricity demand too that we've already been talking about, and there's already kind of been that challenge set up. This increases the challenge, but it's still like there's this drive to build out more of the grid, and we're talking We're not talking about like a, order of magnitude increase in the grid. We're talking about, increasing it by 10%, which is a lot, but it has been done before.
A little more directly to what I think you're asking, I wouldn't say there's some ceiling that we're going to, especially as Arman was describing, we're not talking about 10xing the electricity use needed. So there's not some ceiling that I would think we would hit. It's more about the speed and the rate year after year, like how much can be built. So that's where we're seeing the pressure, but I don't think there's some issue where we just can't do more AI. We can't do, especially as we think about all the research going on for like new generation technologies with nuclear, with geothermal. Obviously we have gas and traditional types of energy supply as well that can all play a role, especially as we think a bit longer term. And we do see in terms of the grid expansion, we do see a lot of talk in the data center industry about, just building off the grid. So they're procuring generators, and there's challenges there too. If you have a gas line, the gas grid could also have capacity issues or reliability issues. That need to be factored in, and there's a huge cost to build out the level of reliability that the data centers want. To build that out for one site, you're really, really overbuilding that generation. So it's expensive, but we do see it happening, starting to happen. So that's another way they're sort of getting ahead of the constraints and the timeline constraints on the grid.
Another aspect is even with the grid that we have, like there's a lot more that we can get out of it because the grid doesn't run at like the amount that's generated, it's not running at full capacity all the time. There are times where there's, if we can, and I'm going to let Sarah talk about this more because this is her area, but like if we can be a little bit more strategic about when we're asking for that electricity, it's not just energy efficiency in terms of like, well, how can you use less electricity, but it's also sort of when can you use that electricity, and that can allow the grid to provide more electricity.
And I was just curious in terms of renewable data sources. First of all, do data centers consume the same amount of power 24/7 in general? And the second part is in terms of these renewable data sources, does this power requirement constrain the locations where you can place data center?
The load shapes question is one we've been looking at a lot. If you go back again 5-10 years, you did see very, very flat loads at data centers, and that was the way the cooling systems were designed, as well as the way the servers were. Even if they were idling, they would still kind of be drawing similar amounts of power all the time. But as the industry got more efficient, we see more fluctuation in, for example, a lot of data centers use when it's cold enough outside, they just blow in outdoor air, the free air economizers, to cool the facility. And then only when it's too hot to do that, you start running your chillers and your other systems. So you definitely see fluctuation, which most of the US grid is peaking on hot summer days when everyone's running their air conditioner. So it's kind of that coincident load is a challenge. On the IT side, the kind of usage pattern side, something we're really trying to figure out, really trying to get more data on, because we understand that, there's a lot of really intelligent job scheduling and control systems to try to make the most use of this equipment as they can. But there's of course also user demands that are going to be correlated with the daily patterns of the users you're serving. So we're still trying to wrap our heads around how the IT load either fluctuates in a predictable way or it just is very noisy, more or less noisy. And then you kind of layer the cooling needs on top of that. I mean, we see a lot being built in Texas for many, many reasons. Texas has a lot of wind and solar power, but also has, the way the energy market's structured and the way the interconnection process is and everything. It's been, especially for like Bitcoin mining facilities, they can be market integrated and can, I guess, there's a ton of those facilities in Texas. So there's some correlation there. I mean, it's hard to know where these companies' heads are at with their, if they do have goals around carbon and renewable energy, like in this moment, how they're factoring that in. We also see, a lot of gas plants being built for the new facilities, in Louisiana and other places like that. There's a lot of opportunity, but yeah, I'm not sure kind of what the trends are with that.
It's
Yeah,
interesting that you brought up Texas because I think they're still separated from the power grid of the US, right?
Yes, ERCOT, there's three interconnects in the US. There's Eastern, Western, and then Texas is kind of, yeah, doesn't cross state lines.
Texas is like sort of has independent power grid, like it's like a separate like entity, or how is it?
There are certain regulations that they are not subjected to. FERC, I believe. I'm not sure about NERC. Yeah, there are certain federal regulations because they don't cross state lines that they don't have to adhere to. So they kind of have their own ways of planning and, reliability and all of that stuff. Yeah.
but even within, like, if we're looking at, ERCOT, we're looking at Texas. I mean, there's going to be a mix of solar and wind and gas, and where the solar in one place, there could be generated electricity, in another place it's not, and so all these things are all mixed together in terms of what's available on the grid. So, I think renewables, like, have a potential to work with data centers well because they're just part of everything else that's in there, including storage.
Specifically for Northern California, electric power consumers, what are the implications for rates for PG&E customers given the soaring demand?
It can be tricky because, electricity prices, it's not a like an open market, it's regulated. And so it's going to depend on, each utility will be a little bit different. It depends on how the contracts are set up. We have seen electricity prices go up in in the areas like in North Virginia, where there was a lot of data centers being built, but in other areas it really depends. It comes down to, it's a case by case basis if it's actually going to affect like the rates, and there's no reason that it has to. Like, it's not like that could be something that the utilities address. So that's one of those things that being able to put attention on that so that the data center industry is not like having, residential ratepayers pay for their electricity use. And I don't think they want to. I mean, in terms of like what the cost is, like they're driving to get the best price they can get, of course, but like they're just working within the sort of whatever the constraints are of the contracting of the utilities.
So, but do you think that that trend might continue, that electricity bills will keep growing in certain regions?
They'll probably keep growing. I don't know that the data centers will necessarily be to blame, but it just seems to be the world we're in. Yeah, as people who live in Northern California, we definitely understand that question. And I think, yeah, there's, like Arman was saying, it's a policy question, it's a rate design question. There's a long history of offering attractive electricity rates to certain industries that an area is trying to bring. So like in the Southeast, you see a lot of really low costs to bring industry and help those areas. So there's a lot of decisions to be made there. And I will say right now that it's a very active area. You see regulatory proceedings across many states and many grid regions where the utilities are submitting new rate cases of saying, oh, hey, we actually think we need to change the way we think about these customers because they're so large, they're so concentrated. Our other ways of doing it might not be the best for everyone. So you see a lot of those happening, and I think they are trying to prevent that cost shift. And the data centers, from what we hear, they don't want that cost shift to happen. They don't want that negative kind of to have that negative impact, but they're very careful. They also don't want it to swing too far the other direction and they be covering a lot of the expenses that other people are benefiting from. So it's kind of this balance of figuring out how those costs get allocated and how the utility protects themselves from the risk of building all this capacity. So you're seeing a lot of commitments being put into the rates where if you ask for this amount of power, then for the next 10 years, you have to pay for some portion of that power, half of that power, 80% of that power, because if the utility is going to go build all of that infrastructure, they want to make sure that revenue comes back in to account for it. So I think there's a lot of efforts being made to protect customers on this topic. And
one of the concerns where ratepayers could be getting like increase in costs would be if the utilities build out a bunch of power generation for its data centers, for the AI data centers, and then, they all bust and they go away and those companies all go bankrupt. And then there's all this capital expenditure that the utilities built, they're still going to need to pay for it. It's still going to be sort of processed into the cost of electricity for that region.
If we're indeed in AI bubble, then there will be like consequences.
But like what Sarah is saying is they're putting that into the contract now. They're essentially making them pay up front.
As we see, what I know your report has both the electric and water usage. Were you guys able to calculate the PUE and the WUE? And now with data centers taking about 7 trillion gallons of water, do you have any recommendations on not only the people that are building the data centers, but the people that are building AI on top of the data centers, how they can measure that in their KPIs and how they're developing and using compute? And then separately, as we see more electric and water being used by centralized hyperscalers, AMD and other companies are looking at more bringing things to the edge, bringing GPUs and that to your computers so that you can do inferencing, which is huge consumption of electricity, bringing that to the edge and only using centralized compute to use that electricity and water and kind of like spreading out that effect on the planet.
Just for quick background, PUE and WUE are just like efficiency metrics for like how much electricity essentially the cooling system uses and how much water the cooling system uses. We do model that, so we don't actually have measured data on like what the PUE and WUE of data centers are, but we model it based on sort of what for a given electrical load in a certain location, based on a certain type of cooling system, what the PUE and WUE would be. But now, one thing that's important to kind of take into account is that when you increase your water use, for the most part, the reason why you're increasing your water use there is to like have a cooling tower. It's a way to exhaust the heat out of the building, and it's an efficiency strategy. So increasing your WUE will decrease your PUE, or to say another way, when you use more water, you end up using less electricity. And if you use less water, there's a good chance you're going to use more electricity. So there's a balance, and what is appropriate depends on what's more constrained in different locations. If you're in a water sort of constrained region, then you're not going to want to design a system that uses a lot of water. But if you're in an area that has enough water, then that is a more efficient strategy. So it gets tricky in terms of how to like what's the best, and it depends on what the location is and what the resources are for that location.
And that power demand is also accompanied by water consumption. A lot of power plants in the US use water for that same cooling type of process. And especially certain designs of like nuclear plants and things that people are looking towards as new energy technologies can be quite water intensive. So it's good to kind of think holistically and not, if there's headlines about one specific site versus, one company versus another, one site versus another, just, kind of thinking about the full picture there, I think is important. And then, yeah, you mentioned it's really great to hear the question around, thinking about ways that developers and companies can understand their impact of what they're using. And I think one thing that would be impactful on the water side is, again, the timing of that demand, because like I was mentioning before, a lot of the cooling systems, you don't need to use any water or a lot of power if it's, cooler outside. They can be very efficient. But if it is that hottest day of the year and it is a facility that has water-based cooling systems, then during those hours, then it will vary, day by day and hour by hour, what the impacts are of running a given job. So I have no idea what the kind of evolving nature is. Cloud service providers and co-location providers and things kind of communicating those metrics on a more variable basis. But I think that would be something to maybe advocate for is, if there was flexibility in when you run those jobs, then, waiting to run at night or something like that could be one way to save.
Is there like a risk of like sort of negative impact on environment? I mean, it depends on like how much water do they need, and if the demand will continue, they will need more water. I'm just trying to understand what might be like consequences, right, of that for environment, for humanity.
So, I mean, the main two ways that the data center operation interacts with the environment is the electricity that it uses and the water that it consumes. There are other ways that when we start thinking about materials that are needed for the chips, but not to get things too complicated, like just focusing on the electricity use in the water, it really comes down to where you're using that water. If there's water available and if there's electricity available, and what are going to be the environmental impacts of that particular electricity use and of that water use. And that it's tricky because it's different in every location. Just like thinking about electricity use, it's different, depending on the source of the electricity.
Your report highlights the significant electricity and water demands of the AI data center boom in the US, right? So since I'm in Brazil, I'm particularly concerned about, based on these findings, what specific risks do you foresee in expanding this high demand model to nations in the global south? Especially those with the vulnerable grids and water resources.
We haven't looked too much into beyond the U.S. Our scope has been looking at U.S. Electricity growth. I mean, I can say that like roughly the U.S. is around half of the growth that we're seeing in AI. So the other half is being distributed around the world, and that could change in the future. Like there could be sort of more outside of the U.S. There has been like some of the large companies have talked about, and I think this is probably what you're kind of referencing, talking about building,
yes,
in the global south, to build more of a presence there. I would think the impact of that would be more on a case by case basis. Like probably looking in the future that the absolute electricity use amount of data center sort of activity would probably be only a percentage of, smaller percentage of what we're seeing globally. But for a particular region, it could be like highly impactful.
You specifically worded your question around areas that might have vulnerable grids. I could imagine a world where there's kind of a win-win effect. These data centers do not deal with vulnerable, like they don't, they have very, very low tolerance for outages and disruptions and really high reliability requirements. So if they are going to go in and build, they're going to be having those backup power systems, having that in relationship with whoever's providing their energy that requires that higher reliability. And so depending on, it goes back to policies and designs of rate structures and things like that. If they're willing to pay to maybe even strengthen that grid, then I could imagine in some cases it being a positive effect. There's a lot of money obviously going into these data centers, and maybe there is an opportunity to have positive spillover. Maybe I'm being a bit, ambitious here, but I could imagine that being the case. But it would need to be designed for that. It would need to be designed to have that positive spillover and not just benefit the one site. Water, I'm not quite sure if you could make the same argument. Water is a bit more of a finite resource, but on the power side.
So, you read a lot about how China excels at building out infrastructure. There's been stories just in the last week or so about how they build very high tension power lines across the country, and they build nuclear plants. And I understand that this comes at a cost, right? Like they steamroll individuals who stand in the way of progress, and they don't care very much about the environment, seemingly. I find myself wondering, like, Sarah and Arman, if China is not limited in their ability to build out energy capacity, and we are, to what extent do you think that gives them an advantage in the AI race? Maybe this is outside your scope, but it comes immediately to my mind.
I mean, if it was just down to who could build more electricity infrastructure faster, yes, I think historically what we've seen in the last decade or couple decades, China can build much faster than the US. And that's more of a sort of policy, like you're implying, a policy sort of drive. But I think there's just other aspects of it. It's like, are the chips available? Where are the companies? It's the whole Silicon Valley effect. Like, all of that kind of plays a role to know like what kind of, how much of an advantage that gives China. And we're definitely kind of veering outside of our expertise at this point. We're not like, policy advisors.
Do you think, like, considering the rate they're like building their infrastructure and trying to incorporate the renewable energy, do you think there might be some advantage, or it's like, or actually not really, because it all comes down again to chip production? Just trying to understand if they can potentially have an edge over the US or not because of how they build their electricity infrastructure.
I think conceptually, for that to benefit them, it would need the kind of opposite would need to be true, right? That the limitations in the US are holding us back. And we are talking a lot about the time it takes to build and some of these timelines and constraints, but I think, I guess I won't try to answer that question necessarily, but I think, to the extent that it is actually hindering the US development, then yes, potentially there is, an advantage that others are gaining. But I don't know that we're there yet. Or I don't know, maybe we could look for signs of like, are these big American companies starting to build outside of the US? And that might be a sign what's happening in the US is actually slowing things down. It's hard to.
Yeah, like I mean, maybe a way to think about it is, yes, I think China can build the infrastructure faster, but the US can probably build it fast enough.
I was just commenting. I mean, like I think it's under 10 cents in a kilowatt hour in Russia, and the margins aren't that high on crypto mining. So, like to try to run a grow light or a big computer to mine crypto or to run AI local, at your house in America, it's hard to even be profitable as it is. A 10 times cheaper electricity is a huge advantage, and I just see it all going overseas personally.
The cost of electricity as a driver is pretty different with AI compared to crypto. With crypto, you're right, it's very sensitive to that cost. With AI, at this point, we don't know how profitable it's going to be yet. But the companies that are investing have been highly profitable, and considering the amount of investment that's putting, like the chips are way more expensive than the electricity, like overall, like so it's the cost of electricity is a much smaller portion when we think about AI.
But it should still be a race to the bottom. Like, it's still a commodity. The access event, within the next 10 years, access to these chips will be a commodity. And so, like, the only argument for keeping it here is just national security, and which is a pretty good one.
And this goes back to the conversation around siting. Something we're continuously trying to keep tabs on and understand is to what extent, latency and proximity to users is important in siting, especially as inference grows, so and kind of dwarfs the training demands. You need to be near the people you're serving, and additionally, this is something I've very limited knowledge on, but heard comments about is where your data is, these kind of like data oceans or data gravity, this idea that, it may be more on the training side, or I'm not sure, maybe for inference as well, like all that data that you're using to build these models, there is some proximity that you want to have just physically to where that's all being stored. So I think there's also, factors like that would, even if things do start to be developed elsewhere, like you said, chasing the lowest cost electricity, there would still be, substantial reason to have a large footprint in the US.
Yeah, it's like there's just so many other sort of soft costs that go into the business decisions. A lot of us are right now in Northern California, and we're paying way too much for our own rent right now. And if you all of you that are doing AI, and if you're in the Bay Area, you're doing it because this is where the AI is. And why is it here? Because there's that institutional knowledge. There's just so much kind of structure that's set up, and those all play a role.
I just am trying to understand, like, what are the key differences between a closed loop water system in a data center, specifically like newer builds, and a non-closed loop? Like, because my understanding is that the closed loop system would only have to be filled once.
So I think it depends on where that loop is that you're referring to. So there's two steps in terms of removing the heat from the chips. You're taking the heat off the chip into some other medium, and like that could be some sort of coolant, for example. And then you have to take the heat off the coolant, and that could be with some kind of water. And then an open loop would then be using like a cooling tower in some way to like have some evaporative cooling as a method of of cooling the system. The closed loop, so there can be different systems where you're cooling that what's going through the system, you're cooling in some other ways. And it starts to get like outside of like we're not like mechanical engineers that sort of specialize in this, but there's so many different ways that you can start setting up your cooling systems to be more efficient. So we have seen it both ways in terms of whether there's an open loop or closed loop, and I think there's like pros and cons in each one.
I saw Google make that announcement, Amazon and Microsoft, that they're building those small nuclear modular reactors. What's your estimate if this like really will help sort of take the edge of the pressure from current infrastructure, how that might in general. Yeah, well, what's your take on this? To moving from traditional electricity to these nuclear reactors, and how fast it might happen, because I guess it's also
Yeah.
pretty difficult, right, to do.
There are a lot of expected benefits. They produce, consistent baseload power. Some of the new designs with the small modular ones can have, very limited risk of any sort of runaway thermal issues or, kind of meltdown issues. It's just a different format. Not my expertise, but, from what I've heard, we have seen progress in terms of the regulatory commissions, certifying or approving, the first of these designs. So, we see movement happening, but it also feels like for the last 5 years, people have been saying we'll have them in 5 years. So it's kind of hard to say, are we actually 5 years out now, or in 5 years will we be saying 5 years? I just, I don't know, but definitely, yeah, a lot of potential benefits and a lot of interest, and of course, the magnitude of energy that nuclear could provide is striking. Yeah.
In sort of a way to think about like the strategy that we want to be thinking about building out the grid is, for the type of electricity sources that we have now, we want to build them out as quickly as we can. Ideally, the clean sources of electricity, while looking at new types of clean sources of generation that we can build out in the future. And SMRs kind of goes into that, with the one in the future. That's sort of like you're hedging your bets by investing in that, and like that could be one of the things that pans out, along with like enhanced geothermal in some other sort of kind of newer or innovative kind of electricity generation sources.
What others, like what are the other examples could be besides those modular reactors, like renewable energy? Is there like anything else that people considering?
Geothermal is kind of the one that's I kind of feel like it's in the same bucket as nuclear. There's a lot of interest in it, a lot of research going on, and there's a lot of different types of how you get that energy, and enhanced geothermal and things like that some need more research than others. So yeah, that's kind of the biggest one. Yeah, I'm not sure.
I mean, there's some data centers
Yeah.
talking about fusion, but that's really looking far out.
And there's always like different ways of doing solar that, I mean, we've mostly established in terms of like the PV photovoltaic cells versus concentrated solar thermal. There's, biomass, there are, other categories, but yeah, nuclear and geothermal are kind of the big ones that have a large magnitude of potential and are kind of somewhere out on the horizon.
About fusion, actually, we had a physicist here who was working on fusion. He sort of like gave up on it. So I don't know. So probably it's a signal. Yeah, we're getting to to the end of our discussion. I'm just wondering, you've spent so much time thinking about this, analyzing data. Is there like anything that surprised you? Like when you're analyzing that data, like seeing that trends, is there anything that, like you felt like, oh, wow, like this is like really unusual, like something like they really kind of stand out for you in your mind?
It's striking to me we were looking at some data. I was looking at some data with one of our team members yesterday around, we were kind of looking at your data every day, one chip, 2 chip servers, and looking at the trends of like the core counts per chip, and just all of these trends you look at in terms of the hardware and the technology progress are these exponential curves. And obviously you have like Moore's law that was, the big topic for decades. And I mean, the continued exponential advancements in the computations, the flops that these systems can do, and the increasing densities, and all of this efficiency is happening. It's just the demands are so far outpacing it. So I mean that's always very impressive and striking to me when I look at the numbers for these new systems.
Another thing that really like kind of stood out when we did the report, last December, and also as we're kind of updating it now and looking at like the data, is just the rate of growth of the amount of chips that have come online, specifically like GPUs or ASICs, like went from essentially like nothing, just not even like showing up or just being too small to even see it in the data like before like 2017, to just such a fast rate of increase that now the GPUs are just dominating the electricity use of the entire data center market.
The speed of evolution, I mean, it manifests itself in all of these conversations. Like if we talk about the load shape of a data center, or we talk about how it could be sited or how it could integrate with some energy system, anything we say today, like collectively, could be different tomorrow. And that's, this industry can be, there were some questions I saw in the chat about data. Do people share data on this or that? And they're private with their data for a lot of reasons, but one of the ones I've more recently come to appreciate is that even if they tell us what their water use was or what their load shape was last month, that doesn't mean, these things are evolving. The way the systems are managed, the workloads they're being asked to do are evolving so quickly, and we have all we can do is just try to keep up and make informed decisions given that uncertainty that we face.
What is the trade-off by building data center in other country instead? How feasible is this approach? I guess it also depends on geopolitical situation, right? Like you like you have to choose countries that are like your partners, and if those partners have the infrastructure, right?
There are data centers built in other parts of the world right now, and so there is areas that want to build more data centers, and so there's this balance of do the companies, this kind of goes back to the question before, do the companies want to like move a lot of their investment to a different location, like for a cheaper cost of operation? That might be the right business move, but it comes down to a kind of strategic business decision at that point.
We can't say it's a trend, right? The companies building outside of the US, those data centers, or there is some trend like emerging.
There's building everywhere right now, but the overwhelming majority of it is in the US. So there is some happening in other places. It's
like places like where?
What other places?
Yeah.
Like in the UAE is an area that there's been sort of a desire to build data centers. So I think there's been activity there.
And like Arman mentioned before, currently it's about half of, like 50 to 60% of that data center activity is in the US. So there is already, there's services being provided to those users. There's companies that are not American companies, of course. So with, most of the big AI developers currently are in the US, and that is where they're building. So that portion is when we think about energy use, is probably shifting a bit as AI grows so fast. But, still substantial markets elsewhere.